Tabular narrative in fiction is where the author presents the reader with independent, parallel, simultaneous narrative tracks and leaves it to the reader to navigate how to move back and forth to handle these simultaneous tracks. It is a very structural approach to telling a story, and it can create a lot of dilemmas for the reader and certainly can create an effect and an impact that is difficult to create any other way. So the earliest example I know of tabular narrative in fiction is in John Barth's The Floating Opera. This is all the way back to the 1950s. And what happens is this is a first-person narrative told from the first-person past tense of the person who's telling the story. So there's a lot of I in here. And there's a recognition that I'm telling a story from the past. So with that, chapter 20, Calliope music starts as follows, quote, "My prose is a plodding, graceless thing, and I've no comprehension for stylistic tricks. Nevertheless, I must begin this chapter in two voices, because it requires two separate introductions delivered simultaneously." And then at that point, the prose actually breaks into two columns and runs that way. And so this leaves the reader with a dilemma, right? And I've been told real specifically there are two separate introductions that must be delivered simultaneously. So now how do I deal with the simultaneity of this, right? Do I read the one column all the way down and then go back and read the other column all the way down and have them not be simultaneous? Do I skip back and forth? How frequently do I skip back and forth? Or should I read a paragraph at a time, or a page at a time, or a line at a time? Now, Barth further complicates this for us by syncing up the two introductions at the same spot on the page, so that there's various places that where some simultaneity occurs. And if you just choose to read the one column all the way down and then go back and read the other column all the way down, you're going to miss that element of the storytelling, and you're going to miss out for that. So Barth is going to make it even tougher on you by putting that in. And like I said, so two columns, absolutely tabular in its nature. You got to run those two simultaneously. We see something similar in Samuel R. Delaney's Dahlgren. So this large novel contains a section near the end where more than one time it breaks into simultaneous columns. And I'll do this several times in this part of the book, where there will be a column on the left and a column on the right, and they're both running together. And again, you as the reader need to figure out how to navigate this. Are you going to read the one column then the other one? Which one are you going to read first? Are you going to read the main narrative columns and read the breakouts later? Are you going to do the breakouts at the time? Are you going to finish? How are you going to do that? And again, you're presented with this problem and not really given the solution. You're not given a model kit for how to solve this. You have to figure it out on your own, and this need to figure it out and this act of figuring out is part of the effect that the author is getting. So the thing about both Dahlgren and The Floating Opera is these are fairly short passages. They go for a page or two. So it's not all that hard to navigate. You could just read the one and then read the other. It's not that big a deal. So Steve Katz is going to do us one better. In his 1968, I think it is, absolute postmodern tour de force, The Exaggerations of Peter Prince. Steve Katz actually breaks his narrative from one to two columns, and then runs this two-column parallel simultaneous narrative for the next 20 pages. And then, after 20 pages of this, the rightmost column breaks again into two columns. So now I have three columns, the original leftmost column and the two children of the rightmost column, and that runs for another 18 pages, which gives me a lot to think about in terms of how I am going to digest this part of the book, right? How much of column 1 am I reading before I move on to column 2? And then column 2 has these two sub-columns. What am I doing about that? Do I treat all three columns equally? And I got to remember, these are sub-columns of which one? So it's very interesting And again, as a reader, it leaves you wrestling with, how do I deal with this? Now, I don't own, so there's another example of this, and I don't own this book, and I haven't read it. I haven't read it because I don't own it, and I can't get it in my local library. That's called Bottom's Dream, is the English translation by Arno Schmidt. It's originally written in German, and this is a massive, massive novel. It's a giant book. It's got a huge page count, a huge word count. It's heavy. It's enormous, and it actually runs in 3 columns. There's the main narrative in the middle column, and then there are these 2 side columns with other narrative and commentary, and that runs the entire length of the novel that way. So Bottom's Dream would be another great example of that. Maybe I'll be lucky enough to get my hands on a copy one day. I don't have one, so I can't show it to you, and I can't talk about it from firsthand experience, but that has come up in other places as an example of that. So that's one way you could do it. You could literally lay out physical columns together on the page. Another way you can do it, though, is you can introduce logic in the book that forces the reader to skip back and forth and deal with simultaneous narratives in parts of the books simultaneously. And Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov, something we've talked about in the past, is a great example of this. It starts with this long poem, a 990-line poem, or arguably it should be a 1,000-line poem, which is part of the point of the book. So this, call it a 1,000-line poem, is in the beginning of the book, but then most of the back of the book is annotations on what happens in the poem. And so these are going line by line. So here, line 400, line 493, etc. And when I get to that annotation, I kind of need to go back and look at that line in that part of the poem to understand what the annotation is saying. And to some degree, I may have to be reading the context of the poem. So in the process of reading the novel Pale Fire, one reads the entire poem Pale Fire multiple times. Because the first thing, it's the front of the book, you read the poem, then you start moving into the novel, and you keep going back and reading portions of the poem again to make sense of what's in the novel. So you have to kind of balance and skip how you move between the two. Another book that very much is the direct spiritual of offspring of Pale Fire is The Red Handler, as the translated title goes, by Johan Harstad. And The Red Handler is a very similar thing. It presents, the first roughly half of the book, let's say, presents what are said to be the short mystery novels of this author. And obviously, if all of his short novels are sitting in half a book, these are very short novels, and that's part of the point. He's riffing on the idea of minimalism a little bit, and he's got this extraordinarily minimalist aesthetic in this guy's writing. And then the second half of the book is the annotations on the minimalist novels that are in the first half of the book. And while Pale Fire really is the story of the commentator on the poem, The Red Handler is the story of the author of these books. So as we go into the annotations, we're learning about the man who authored these books, and that's really what the second half of it is about. But again, it's a similar thing. What I did when I read this was I read all the short novels. And then when I got through the short novels, I started reading the annotations, and I had to go back and look back at the short novels to understand what was being annotated, and I basically wound up reading all of the short novels again more than once as I was going through the annotations. So I moved back and forth because I had to get my head around what was in that short novel, and I had to get my head around what was in the annotation, just as with Pale Fire. And so that's another way that it's tabular. You, as the reader, are forced to apprehend and deal with parallel, simultaneous narratives. Now, if we want to talk about postmodern tour de force novels, let's talk about Infinite Jest. So Infinite Jest, of course, is a tour de force in many ways and will come up time and again. One of the things about this absolutely massive book, more than 1,000 pages worth of text, is that at the end of it is almost 100 pages of endnotes. Nearly 400 endnotes. And these endnotes are essential. If you don't read the endnotes, you won't understand what's going on in the book. So you can't skip them, and you can't read the whole book and then read the endnotes. You've got to deal with them while you're reading the book, or you won't get it. But these endnotes themselves can go on for pages and pages. Some of them have their own footnotes. So now what I need to do is I need to figure out how I'm dealing with this. When I recommend to people, when you read Infinite Jest, read it with 2 bookmarks, one in the main narrative and one in the endnotes, right? And you can find yourself sitting and reading the endnotes for a long period of time. And you got to do them both. And then this presents the dilemma. I'm working on the main narrative, and when am I going to skip? And I'm reading along, and I see that number, and it says 176. Okay, am I going to do with this now? But I'm midway through a thread and action, and I'm learning things and stuff going on. Am I going to come back to this later? How am I going to do this? So the reader has to figure this out. And the fact that the reader has to figure this out is part of what makes this novel interesting and unique and engaging in a very unusual way, and part of what makes it ultimately postmodern. And of course, the other thing to think about with Infinite Jest is, and this happens in a decent amount of tabular fiction, is the author doesn't necessarily make it super easy. The author isn't spoon-feeding it to you, because if it's spoon-feeding it to you, then this moving back and forth thing is easier, and it's not such an interesting question. It's a more interesting question when you're sitting and puzzling things out. And David Foster Wallace very famously forces you to sit and puzzle things out. So while I'm puzzling things out, while I'm trying to understand, I've been dropped midstream into some narrative, and I've got to figure out the context just from little clues that are dropped, and I'm trying to do that, and I don't know where I am or what's going on or why any of this is happening. Suddenly, in the midst of all of this, I'm given this little footnote. Will the footnote explain it to me? Maybe that's what's going to figure it out to me. Will the footnote distract me and send me off on a dogleg that itself is interesting, where I'm figuring that out? And it didn't help me solve the main narrative, and I'm going to still have to come back and wrestle with the main narrative? These are all questions that you get when the author makes you work a little on the main narrative as well. And so that's part of why the footnotes are, I think, so interesting and important in Infinite Jest. So all of that's great, but let's talk about the ultimate example of a tabular narrative. And this is Only Revolutions by Mark Danielewski. Now, Mark Danielewski is best known for his book House of Leaves. And some people like to point at House of Leaves to do what they call, quote unquote, ergodic. I think ergodic is not a very useful word, and we'll get to that later. But if you want to talk about forcing the reader to deal with multiple streams, you're much better off talking about Only Revolutions. Same author, much better example. So how Only Revolutions works is you can start reading the book from either side. And whichever side you pick, you're going to read the story of this encounter and this anecdote that has 2 main characters, Haley and Sam. And because I have chosen this side at random to read from, the big capital H indicates to me that I'm starting with Haley's narrative. And as I start to read this, you'll see, first of all, it is also multi-columnar. And it is multi-columnar the whole way. So I already have that little bit of tabularism to deal with, which is I've got the main narrative here, but I've got this other stuff over here, and I've got to figure out how I'm going to deal with those two. But then at the same time, while I'm looking at the big text at the top, there's a little bit of small upside-down text at the bottom of this page. And as I turn the pages, I keep reading the main stack, there's more and more of that upside down text. And over time, the top text gets smaller and takes up less of the page, and the bottom text gets bigger and takes up more of the page, until when I've gotten to about the middle of the page, about the middle of the book, they're both roughly the equal size. They're both roughly taking half the page, and they're both, roughly the same point size. Now I keep going, and the narrative I'm reading here, the right setup narrative, is smaller and smaller and taking less of the page, and the bottom narrative is bigger and bigger and taking more until I get to the end. And that is because if I just take the book and turn it over, I can do the exact same thing on the other side. And this time, instead of Haley, now I'm looking at the S, I'm looking at Sam's narrative. And to furthermore make things interesting, Mr. Danielewski has the exact same place in the narrative occurring on the exact same page inward on either side. So page 5 of Haley's narrative has the same place in the anecdote as page 5 of Sam's narrative, and page 236 of Haley's narrative has the same place in the anecdote as page 236 of Sam's narrative. So now you are presented with the opportunity to track the two of them and how they're saying the same episode from different perspectives side by side. And you have to figure this out. Am I going to sit and read all of Sam and then turn around and read all of Haley? Am I going to read 1 page of Sam and 1 page of Haley, 5 pages of Sam and 5 pages of Haley? Danielewski doesn't tell you. You as the reader need to figure it out. Now, he seems to recognize, though, that there's a good chance that you're going to try to do that because he has bound 2 ribbons into this book to track where you are. And the ribbons very politely, thank you, Mark, are color-coded. So the green ribbon goes with the green spot color on the front. Or if you turn it over, the yellow ribbon goes with the yellow spot color. So I can move through both of them simultaneously, imagining somewhere along the line the ribbons cross and then go down to the other side. So you might say, okay, well, that's fine, but which of these is ultimately prominent? Which side of the book is really the top side? And the answer is, it is completely and utterly equal. They both have a title page. They both have copyright information and Library of Congress information, the stuff you would expect. If I turn it around, I'll see the same thing on the other side. Copyright information, Library of Congress information. The page numbers run both directions simultaneously. So I see what page I am of Haley and what page I am of Sam. So this book is completely ambiguous, and it's absolutely symmetrical in terms of which side you start from. And again, I have to work through them both to make sense of the story. So this is as tabular. I cannot imagine what you would do that would be more tabular than Only Revolutions by Mark Danielewski. So those are some examples. There are probably more of how authors play with this simultaneity and forcing the reader to choose and forcing you to put your attention on only one thing, and how are you going to shift your attention when all of these things want your attention equally well. Tabularism in narrative. Thank you very much.